Case 1. Brenda Andrew. At North Point Baptist Church in Edmond, Oklahoma, 2 Sunday school teachers stood before their congregation and taught lessons about faith, morality, and the sanctity of marriage. By August 2001, Brenda Andrew and James Pavat had begun an affair. 3 months later, they conspired to murder Brenda's husband for an $800,000 life insurance policy that Pavat himself had sold to the victim. What made the plot even more calculated was a detail investigators would discover later. Brenda had also taken out a life insurance policy on Pavat, planning to collect both payouts after Pavat was executed for the murder. The man they killed was Robert Andrew, a 38-year-old advertising executive and fellow church member. The conspiracy ended with both killers on death row, and Brenda Andrew earning the distinction of being the only woman facing execution in Oklahoma. Brenda Evers was born on December 16, 1963, in Enid, Oklahoma, and raised in a devoutly religious Lutheran family. She and her sister Kimberly attended Lutheran grade school, participated in ongoing Ambassadors for Christ, an evangelism program for teens, and worked at a Lutheran summer camp. The upbringing was strict and conservative. Brenda attended Enid High School and later Oklahoma State University. In the 1990s, she competed as a Mrs. Oklahoma contestant. On June 2, 1984, she married Robert Andrew, a man she had known since childhood. The marriage produced 2 children, a daughter named Tricity Marie and a son named Parker Bryce. Brenda worked as a bank teller before becoming a stay-at-home mother. She and Rob joined North Point Baptist Church, where she taught Sunday school and cultivated a reputation as the perfect suburban mom. That image concealed a pattern of infidelity that began years into the marriage. She had multiple affairs, once changing her hair color to red after learning that a man she was interested in preferred redheads. One of her former lovers later testified that he had met her in a grocery store and she had handed him a motel room key over the produce bins. By 2001, the marriage had deteriorated. Rob and Brenda separated in September, and Brenda filed for divorce in early October. The proceedings were contentious, and Brenda was under significant financial stress. Robert Andrew was 38 years old, healthy, and expected to live a long life. He worked as an advertising executive in Oklahoma City and was known as a man of deep faith. He served as a deacon at North Point Baptist Church, sat on the board of Junior Achievement, and worked as director of Positive Tomorrows. Those who knew him described him as optimistic and forgiving. He did not believe in divorce and had reconciled with Brenda multiple times during their troubled marriage. But by the fall of 2001, even Rob's patience had limits. He and Brenda were separated, living apart, and working through custody arrangements for their 2 young children. Rob would come to the family home to pick up Tricity and Parker for visitation. He had no reason to believe that one of those visits would be his last. What happened on the evening of November 20th, 2001, was the culmination of at least 2 murder attempts. In February 2000, Rob had purchased an $800,000 life insurance policy through an agent named James Pavat, with Brenda listed as the beneficiary. Pavat was a fellow member of North Point Baptist Church, a Sunday school teacher, and a recent divorcee who worked as an insurance salesman. He was also a former Army sniper. By August 2001, Pavat and Brenda had begun an affair. The church quietly asked both of them to step away from their teaching positions. In October 2001, someone cut the brake lines on Rob's car. That same day, Rob received a phone call from an unknown woman claiming that Brenda had been in an accident and was in the hospital. The caller turned out to be Pavat's adult daughter, Jana Larson. When Rob rushed to check on Brenda, he discovered his brakes had been sabotaged. He reported the incident to police and told them he suspected Brenda and Pavat were trying to kill him. Phone records later showed that Brenda and Pavat had exchanged 82 calls on the day of the brake line incident and more than 50 calls the following day. Rob also visited his insurance company and told agents that he believed Pavat and Brenda were in cahoots to murder him. He attempted to remove Brenda as the beneficiary of his policy. Brenda and Pavat responded by forging Rob's signature on a transfer document, making Brenda the owner of the policy. On November 20th, 2001, at approximately 7 p.m., Rob Andrew arrived at the family home on the 16,000 block of Hippocat Road in Oklahoma City to pick up his children for the Thanksgiving holiday. Brenda asked him to come into the garage to help her light the pilot light on the furnace. As Rob knelt to ignite the pilot, James Pavat emerged from hiding and shot him in the abdomen with a 16-gauge shotgun. Rob grabbed a trash bag filled with metal cans from the garage floor and used it to shield himself. Pavat reloaded. Brenda took the shotgun and fired a second blast into Rob's chest as he lay on the floor. The bag was later recovered with bullet holes through it. After killing her husband, Brenda shot herself in the left arm with a .22 caliber weapon, creating a superficial wound to support the cover story she was about to tell. Tricity and Parker were in the master bedroom watching television with the volume turned up. They were unaware that their father had just been murdered in the garage. Brenda called 911 and reported that 2 masked gunmen had broken into the garage and attacked her and Rob. When emergency responders arrived, Rob was dead. Brenda was transported to the hospital, where witnesses described her demeanor as unusually calm. The cover story began to unravel almost immediately. Police found no signs of forced entry at the house. The children were unharmed. Rob was found holding the trash bag with bullet holes through it, evidence of his final futile attempt to protect himself. Investigators recovered spent 16-gauge shell casings and a .22 caliber bullet projectile. There was no evidence that masked gunmen had entered or left the property. Phone records told a different story. Brenda and Pavat had been in near constant contact in the weeks before the murder. Forensic analysis of Brenda's gunshot wound determined it was self-inflicted. Blood spatter evidence indicated that Brenda had been standing over Rob when the second, fatal shot was fired. Police also searched the home of Rob's neighbors, the Gigstads, who had been out of town. Inside the house, investigators found a spent 16-gauge shell casing in a bedroom and a damaged shoe rack hidden under a bed. The theory was that Pavat had been hiding in the Gigstads' home, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had accidentally stepped on the shoe rack, and when the Gigstad's son stopped by the house to collect mail, Pavat had been prepared to shoot him if discovered. Rob Andrew had explicitly told police and his insurance company that he believed Brenda and Pavat were trying to kill him. No one had stopped them. On the day of Rob Andrew's funeral, Brenda and her children were nowhere to be found. One of the ministers presiding over the service stood up and announced that the family was not present, prompting alarm among those who had gathered to mourn. Brenda, Pavat, and the 2 children had fled to Mexico. They remained there for 3 months, living as fugitives until their money ran out. In February 2002, authorities arrested them at the U.S.-Mexico border as they attempted to re-enter the country. Both were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. Prosecutors decided to try James Pavat and Brenda Andrew separately. Pavat's trial began in August 2003 in Oklahoma County District Court. Prosecutors built their case methodically, presenting piece after piece of evidence. They detailed Pavat's skills as a former Army sniper, his affair with Brenda, his role in selling the life insurance policy to Rob, and his efforts to prevent Rob from removing Brenda as the beneficiary. The jury convicted Pavat of first-degree murder and conspiracy. On October 21st, 2003, Judge Susan Bragg sentenced him to death. Brenda Andrew's trial began in June 2004 and lasted 17 days. Judge Susan P. Caswell presided. Prosecutor Gayland Giger presented overwhelming evidence of Brenda's role in the conspiracy. He introduced phone records, the forged insurance document, Rob's warnings to the insurance company, forensic evidence showing Brenda's wound was self-inflicted, and blood spatter analysis proving she had fired the fatal shot. Pavat had confessed to shooting Rob, though he denied that Brenda had been involved. The physical evidence told a different story, but the prosecution did not stop with evidence of the crime. Giger called two of Brenda's former lovers to the stand and questioned them in detail about their sexual relationships with her. He introduced testimony about affairs Brenda had engaged in 2 decades earlier, when she was a college student. He asked witnesses about the clothing she wore to restaurants and grocery stores. He questioned whether a good mother would dress or behave the way Brenda had. In closing arguments, Giger opened a suitcase Brenda had packed for her flight to Mexico and held up a thong and lace bra in front of the jury. "The grieving widow packs this to run off with her boyfriend," he asked. During the trial, the prosecution referred to Brenda as a slut puppy and a hoochie. The defense argued that Brenda was a victim, pointing to her gunshot wound as evidence. They introduced a letter that Brenda claimed Pavat had written, taking sole responsibility for the murder. They argued that a good mother would never go to such lengths as killing the father of her children. The jury was not persuaded. After 6 hours of deliberation, they convicted Brenda Andrew of first-degree murder. On September 22, 2004, Judge Susan P. Caswell sentenced Brenda Andrew to death by lethal injection. Brenda entered the courtroom for sentencing smiling, and observers described her as defiant. Approximately 60 family members filled the courtroom. Brenda addressed the court briefly. "The verdict which sentenced me to the death penalty is an egregious miscarriage of justice," she said. Prosecutor Giger responded, "As far as justice can be done in this courtroom, it has been done." Brenda Andrew became the only woman on Oklahoma's death row. The case did not end with sentencing. Brenda appealed her conviction to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, arguing that the prosecution's focus on her sexual history and personal life had been irrelevant and prejudicial. In 2007, the court upheld her conviction and sentence. Judge Arlene Johnson dissented, writing that the trial had been rife with error and included an egregious pattern of introducing evidence that has no purpose other than to hammer home that Brenda Andrew is a bad wife, a bad mother, and a bad woman. Brenda applied for federal habeas relief and was rejected. She appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. In 2023, a 3-judge panel affirmed her conviction in a 2-to-1 vote. Judge Robert Bacharach dissented, writing that the prosecution had portrayed Ms. Andrew as a scarlet woman, a modern Jezebel, sparking distrust based on her loose morals. On January 21, 2025, the United States Supreme Court issued a 7-to-2 decision and summarily reversed the 10th Circuit's ruling. The court acknowledged that prosecutors had, quote, "The justices ordered the case sent back to the 10th Circuit to determine whether the evidence was so unduly prejudicial as to render the trial fundamentally unfair." Justices Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch dissented, writing that the state had produced overwhelming evidence of Andrew's guilt. On January 13, 2026, the 10th Circuit reconsidered the case and affirmed Brenda's conviction in a 3-to-0 decision. The panel concluded that even if gender stereotyping had occurred, it did not substantially undermine the fundamental fairness of the trial. Brenda has until April 2026 to file further appeals. The Oklahoma Attorney General's office has stated that it will request an execution date once all appeals are exhausted. Brenda Andrew is 62 years old. She is incarcerated at the Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in McLeod, Oklahoma, where she has been on death row for 22 years. She is the only woman facing execution in Oklahoma. James Pavat remains on death row as well. He has exhausted all avenues for appeal and awaits execution. The children Brenda and Rob Andrew, brought into the world, lost their father to murder and their mother to a life sentence behind bars. They were in the bedroom watching television when Rob was killed. They were taken to Mexico and missed their father's funeral. The Supreme Court's ruling in January 2025 was historic, a rare recognition that gender-based prosecution tactics can violate constitutional rights. But the recognition came 2 decades too late to change the outcome of the trial. Oklahoma has executed only 3 women since statehood, all of them in 2001. Whether Brenda Andrew will become the 4th remains to be seen. Case 2. Tara Lambert. The undercover police officer listened as the woman across from him described, with a laugh, how she wanted the victim's body disposed of. Use a woodchipper, Tara Lambert suggested. The comment was delivered casually, as though she were discussing landscaping rather than murder. It was July 2015, and the professional model and former pageant contestant was sitting in a Walmart parking lot in Circleville, Ohio, negotiating the price of killing her husband's ex-wife. She handed over a photograph of Kelly Cook, provided detailed instructions on where the woman could be found, and paid a $125 down payment. What Lambert did not know was that the man sitting across from her was an undercover police officer, and every word she spoke was being recorded. She was arrested immediately after the meeting ended, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and convicted based on video and audio recordings that captured her casual enthusiasm for arranging the death of another human being. Tara Lambert was born Tara Arbogast on September 29, 1982, in Ohio. She graduated from high school and attended some college. By her early 30s, she had built a career as a professional model and had competed in pageants. She was known in local modeling circles for her striking appearance and her involvement in the pageant scene. Lambert married a man named Brandon Lambert and became stepmother to his daughters from a previous marriage. The biological mother of those children was a woman named Kelly Cook, and the relationship between Tara and Kelly was hostile from the beginning. The 2 women were locked in a bitter custody dispute, and what witnesses described as a mean girl rivalry that escalated over time. Tara had a documented history of eating disorders and body dysmorphia. Her attorneys would later claim that she suffered from extreme emotional distress, though that claim did little to explain the deliberate steps she took to arrange a murder-for-hire plot. Kelly Cook was the biological mother of Brandon Lambert's daughters, and the woman Tara wanted dead. She was not a stranger or a distant figure in Tara's life. She was a constant presence, tied to Tara through the children they both claimed to care about. The animosity between the 2 women had festered for years, fueled by custody battles and personal resentment. Prosecutors would later describe the motive as pure hatred. Tara did not want Kelly removed from the children's lives for any reason related to the children's welfare. She wanted Kelly gone because she hated her. A mutual acquaintance had contacted police to report that Tara was actively seeking someone to kill Kelly Cook. Law enforcement arranged for an undercover officer to pose as a hitman. On July 28, 2015, Tara met the officer in a Walmart parking lot in Circleville. The meeting was recorded. Tara provided the officer with a photograph of Kelly Cook and gave him specific instructions on where to find her. She paid a $125 down payment and agreed to pay the remainder after the murder was completed. During the conversation, Tara suggested that the hitman dispose of Kelly's body using a wood chipper. The recordings captured Tara's demeanor throughout the meeting. She was calm, engaged, and appeared to find the situation entertaining. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, no indication that she understood the gravity of what she was arranging. The undercover officer allowed the conversation to continue long enough to establish clear evidence of intent. When Tara left the parking lot, she was arrested. Tara Lambert was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The trial took place in 2016 in Pickaway County, Ohio. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the recordings from the undercover operation. Jurors watched video footage of Tara meeting with the officer, heard her laugh while discussing the murder, and listened to her suggest the woodchipper as a method of disposal. The evidence was incontrovertible. The defense argued that Tara was mentally fragile, that she had been entrapped by law enforcement and an informant, and that she had never truly intended to follow through with the plot. The argument failed. The recordings showed a woman who was not coerced, not confused, and not in the grip of a temporary emotional breakdown. She was someone who wanted another person dead and was willing to pay to make it happen. The jury convicted Tara Lambert of conspiracy to commit murder. She was originally sentenced to 7 years in prison. The case did not end with the initial sentencing. Tara's defense team filed an appeal, citing a clerical error in the indictment. The appeal was successful. In 2018, Tara Lambert was resentenced. The new sentence was 5 years in prison, a reduction from the original term. The resentencing did not change the fact of her conviction or the evidence that supported it. It simply adjusted the length of time she would spend incarcerated. Tara served her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She was released in early 2020, having served approximately 5 years. Tara Lambert is 41 years old. She was released from the Ohio Reformatory for Women in early 2020 and is no longer incarcerated. The case became a viral sensation because of the woodchipper comment and the recordings that captured her laughing while planning a murder. Kelly Cook was never harmed. The children at the center of the custody dispute were spared the trauma of losing their biological mother to violence. Tara Lambert spent 5 years in prison and will carry the conviction for the rest of her life. The woodchipper comment, made casually and with a laugh, will likely define her case in the public memory, long after the legal proceedings have been forgotten. Case 3. Peggy Sue. Thomas Whidbey Island, Washington, is a quiet, picturesque community north of Seattle, the kind of place where people know their neighbors and violent crime is rare. In December 2003, a gift shop owner named Russell Douglas was found dead in his car on a secluded driveway, shot once in the head with a Bersa .380 semi-automatic handgun. The investigation into his murder would take nearly a decade to resolve, and when it finally did, the case revealed a tangled web involving a former beauty queen, her boyfriend, and a close friend who may have orchestrated the entire thing. Peggy Sue Thomas had been crowned in the Miss Washington Islander pageant, worked as a beautician and limousine driver, and lived what appeared to be a glamorous life on Whidbey Island. By the time the case was solved, she had been convicted of helping to cover up a murder and had served 3 years in prison. Peggy Sue Thomas was born in 1965 in Washington State. She graduated from high school and became a licensed beautician. She worked a variety of jobs over the years, including as an aircraft mechanic at Boeing, a limousine driver, and the owner of a beauty salon. She had been married multiple times, including to a wealthy rancher, and by the early 2000s, she was living on Whidbey Island, where she cultivated a reputation as a high society figure and glamour girl. She had competed in the Ms. Washington Islander pageant and won. She had no criminal record before the investigation into Russell Douglas's death began. To those who knew her, she appeared successful, confident, and well-connected. Russell Douglas was 32 years old when he was killed. He owned a gift shop and was the father of young children. He was married to a woman named Brenda Douglas, who was one of Peggy Sue Thomas's best friends. The two women were close, and Peggy had been a regular presence in the Douglas household. Russell was lured to a remote driveway under the pretense of receiving a gift for his wife. When he arrived, someone shot him once in the head. He died at the scene. His body was found in his car on December 27, 2003. The murder appeared to be an execution. The investigation into Russell Douglas's death moved slowly. There were no immediate suspects, no obvious motive, and no witnesses. The case went cold. Years passed. Then, in the late 2000s, investigators received new information. Peggy Sue Thomas had been involved in a romantic relationship with a man named James Hewden, a musician who had once lived on Whidbey Island. After Russell's murder, Hewden had fled to Mexico and lived there for several years before returning to the United States. When investigators questioned him, Hewden eventually confessed. He admitted that he had shot Russell Douglas. He claimed that Peggy Sue Thomas had convinced him to do it, telling him that Russell was abusive to Brenna and that killing him would be an act of protection. Hewden said that Peggy had lured Russell to the remote location and that Hewden had pulled the trigger. Peggy denied any involvement. The investigation that had begun in 2003 finally led to arrests in 2011. Peggy Sue Thomas was found living on a houseboat in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She was arrested in July 2011 and charged with rendering criminal assistance, a charge that meant she had helped cover up the murder or had assisted the killer after the fact. She was not charged with murder itself. Prosecutors believed that Peggy had orchestrated the killing, but the evidence was largely circumstantial, and Hewden's testimony alone was not enough to secure a murder conviction. Peggy was offered a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to rendering criminal assistance, the more serious charges would be dropped. She accepted the deal. In January 2013, Peggy Sue Thomas was sentenced by Judge Vicky Churchill to 4 years in prison. She served 3 years before being released in 2016. James Hewden was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 80 years in prison. The case became the subject of Ann Rule's book, Practice to Deceive, which chronicled the investigation and the relationships between the people involved. Rule's account painted Peggy Sue Thomas as a manipulative figure who had used her charm and her relationship with Hewden to arrange Russell Douglas's death. Peggy has maintained that she was not involved in the murder and that Hewden acted on his own. Peggy Sue Thomas is 60 years old. She was released from prison in 2016 and is currently living under a different profile. The case remains a subject of fascination for true crime audiences, in part because of the decade-long gap between the crime and the resolution. Russell Douglas's family was left to grapple with his loss and the knowledge that his murder had been arranged by people he and his wife had trusted. The gift he thought he was receiving turned out to be a lure to his death. The investigation took nearly 10 years, but it eventually brought accountability to those responsible. Case 4. Rachel Mullenix. On September 13, 2006, a 17-year-old beauty pageant contestant and her 23-year-old boyfriend murdered the girl's mother in the family's condominium in Huntington Beach, California. The victim was stabbed more than 50 times. A butter knife was found protruding from her eye. Her body was wrapped in cardboard and dumped in Newport Harbor. The crime was brutal, calculated, and motivated by a teenager's resentment of her mother's disapproval of her older boyfriend. Rachel Mullenix had competed in pageants and had been seen by some as a troubled but promising young woman. What she did to her mother, with the help of Ian Allen, revealed a capacity for violence that no one who knew her had anticipated. Rachel Scarlett Mullenix was born in 1989 in California. She was the daughter of Barbara and Bruce Mullenix. She attended high school and was involved in competitive pageant participation, where she was known as an attractive and ambitious contestant. But beneath the surface, there were signs of trouble. Rachel was described by some as troubled, and her relationship with her mother was strained. By 2006, Rachel was 17 years old and dating Ian Allen, a 23-year-old man. Barbara Mullenix disapproved of the relationship and made her objections clear. That disapproval became the motive for murder. Barbara Mullenix was 56 years old when she was killed. She was a homemaker who had spent years trying to help her daughter navigate a difficult adolescence. Friends remembered her as a woman who loved Rachel and who had worked hard to provide stability and guidance. Barbara's relationship with her daughter had become increasingly contentious as Rachel's behavior grew more erratic and defiant. Barbara believed that Ian Allen was a bad influence, and she tried to separate Rachel from him. That effort cost her her life. On September 13, 2006, in the family's condominium in Huntington Beach, California, Rachel Mullenix and Ian Allen attacked Barbara Mullenix. They stabbed her more than 50 times. The violence was overwhelming and sustained. A butter knife was found protruding from Barbara's eye, a grotesque detail that spoke to the fury of the attack. After killing her, Rachel and Ian wrapped Barbara's body in a cardboard box and disposed of it in Newport Harbor. Rachel later claimed that Ian had forced her to watch the murder and that she had not participated directly. Text messages recovered from her phone told a different story. The messages showed that Rachel had actively participated in planning the murder and had been a willing participant in both the killing and the cover-up. The motive was rebellion. Barbara had disapproved of Ian, and Rachel had decided that the solution was to eliminate her mother. The murder was discovered on September 17, 2006, when Barbara's body was found in Newport Harbor. Investigators quickly identified Rachel and Ian as suspects. The two had fled California and were tracked to Lafayette, Louisiana, where they were apprehended after a high-speed chase. Both were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Rachel was 17 years old at the time of her arrest, but she was charged as an adult. The trial took place in 2008 in Orange County Superior Court. Prosecutor Sonia Belest presented the text messages, the physical evidence from the crime scene, and testimony from witnesses who described Rachel's behavior before and after the murder. The defense argued that Rachel suffered from battered woman syndrome and that Ian Allen had coerced her into participating in the murder. The argument was undermined by the text messages, which showed that Rachel had been an active and willing participant. The jury convicted Rachel Mullenix of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Rachel Mullenix is 37 years old. She is incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She will be eligible for parole in 2026 or 2027, having served approximately 20 years of her sentence. Barbara Mullenix was killed by her own daughter in an act of violence so extreme that it defied the expectations of everyone who had known the family. The butter knife in Barbara's eye became one of the most disturbing details in a case filled with them. Rachel Mullenix will have the opportunity for parole in the near future. Whether she will be granted release remains to be seen. Case 5. Kumari Fulbright, the law student who told a courtroom she was a stone-cold bitch with ice water in her veins, had orchestrated the kidnapping and torture of her ex-boyfriend based on a lie. Kumari Fulbright was a second-year law student at the University of Arizona and a former Miss Arizona contestant when she and 3 men held Joshua Conway at gunpoint, bound him with duct tape and plastic ties, bit him, threatened him with a butcher knife, and subjected him to more than 8 hours of physical and psychological abuse. The justification she gave was that Conway had stolen jewelry from her. That claim turned out to be false. the jewelry had not been stolen. What had actually occurred was a calculated act of revenge carried out by a woman who later confessed to having ice water in her veins. Kumari Simone Fulbright was born on September 29, 1982. By 2007, she was 25 years old and enrolled as a second-year law student at the University of Arizona. She had previously competed in pageants, including the Miss Arizona contest, and had worked as a professional model and legal intern. She came from a middle-class background and appeared to be on a trajectory toward a successful legal career. She had a history of eating disorders and body dysmorphia, issues that her defense attorneys would later cite as contributing factors to her behavior. But those issues did not explain the deliberate and sustained violence she inflicted on Joshua Conway. Joshua Conway was Kumari Fulbright's ex-boyfriend. The details of their relationship and the reasons for their breakup are not fully documented, but by December 2007, the relationship had ended. Fulbright accused Conway of stealing jewelry from her. The accusation was false. No jewelry had been stolen. What followed was not an attempt to recover stolen property. It was an act of retribution. On December 8, 2007, Kumari Fulbright and 3 men confronted Joshua Conway at a private residence in Tucson, Arizona. They held him at gunpoint, bound his hands and feet with duct tape and plastic ties, and subjected him to more than 8 hours of torture. Fulbright bit Conway. She and the men threatened him with a butcher knife. They interrogated him, accused him of theft, and made it clear that they intended to hurt him. The abuse continued for hours. Conway survived, but the experience left him with both physical injuries and lasting psychological trauma. When police investigated the incident, they determined that the theft allegation had been fabricated. Fulbright had orchestrated the kidnapping and assault based on a lie. Kumari Fulbright was arrested in late December 2007 and charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping and aggravated assault. Rather than proceed to trial, Fulbright accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to both charges. At her sentencing hearing, Fulbright made a statement that became one of the most memorable aspects of the case. She told the court, quote, 10. The comment was intended to convey strength or defiance, but it came across as a confession of callousness. The judge sentenced Fulbright to 2 years in prison, followed by 6 years of probation. Kumari Fulbright served her 2-year sentence and was released in 2011. After her release, she became involved in defamation lawsuits related to her portrayal in media coverage of the case. She argued that news outlets and true crime programs had misrepresented her and that the coverage had damaged her reputation. The lawsuits did not change the facts of the case or the conviction that remained on her record. Kumari Fulbright is 43 years old. She was released from prison in 2011 and completed her probation. Joshua Conway was subjected to 8 hours of terror because Kumari Fulbright decided he should be punished for a crime he did not commit. The quote you won one comment became a defining moment in the case, a rare instance of a defendant openly embracing a description that most people would find damning. Case 6, Trinity, Pogue. Dorm mates at Georgia Southwestern State University heard the toddler crying whenever he was left alone with her. The crying was persistent and distressing, but no one intervened. In January 2024, an 18-year-old nursing student and recently crowned beauty queen inflicted catastrophic injuries on her boyfriend's 18-month-old son while babysitting him in her dormitory. The child, Jackson Angelus, suffered blunt force trauma so severe that his liver was destroyed and his brain was rendered non-functional. He died from the injuries. Prosecutors argued that Trinity Pogue had killed the child because she resented his presence in her life and wanted to start her own family with her boyfriend without the burden of his existing son. Trinity Pogue had been crowned Miss Donaldsonville 2023 just months before she murdered a toddler. Trinity Madison Pogue was born in June 2005. She grew up in Georgia and was an honor student who excelled academically. By 2023, she was enrolled as a nursing major at Georgia Southwestern State University in Americus, Georgia. She was described as a straight-A student with a promising future in healthcare. In 2023, she competed in a local pageant and was crowned Miss Donaldsonville, a title that reflected her standing in the community as an accomplished and well-regarded young woman. She was dating a man named Julian Williams, who had an 18-month-old son from a previous relationship. The child's name was Jackson Drew Angelus, and Trinity had taken on a caretaking role when Julian was unable to watch him. Text messages recovered from her phone revealed a different reality. Jackson Drew Angelus was 18 months old when he died. He was the son of Julian Williams and was described by those who knew him as a beloved child. He was too young to speak in full sentences, too young to defend himself, and entirely dependent on the adults who were supposed to care for him. On January 14th, 2024, his father left him in the care of Trinity Pogue in her dormitory at Georgia Southwestern State University. It was the last time Jackson would be seen alive. Trinity Pogue inflicted blunt force trauma on Jackson Angelus in that dormitory room. The injuries were severe enough to cause catastrophic damage to his liver and brain. Medical examiners determined that the child's brain had been rendered useless by the force of the blows. His liver suffered what was described as serious disfigurement. Dormmates testified that they had heard Jackson crying consistently whenever he was left alone with Trinity. The crying was not the normal fussiness of a toddler. It was persistent and distressing. No one intervened. Prosecutors presented text messages in which Trinity had expressed anger and resentment toward Jackson. She had written to friends that she felt frustrated by his presence and that she wanted to start her own family with Julian without the complication of raising his existing child. In one message, she wrote that she felt anger toward the boy and wanted to punch him. OMG. That sounds so bad. The message was not a joke. It was a confession of intent. The investigation began immediately after Jackson's injuries were discovered. He was rushed to a hospital, but the damage was too severe. He died from the injuries Trinity had inflicted. Trinity was arrested and charged with felony murder and first-degree cruelty to children. The trial took place in December 2025. Prosecutors presented the medical evidence, the testimony from dormmates, and the text messages in which Trinity had expressed her resentment of the child. The defense did not present a compelling alternative explanation. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted Trinity Pogue of felony murder and first-degree cruelty to children. On the sentencing date in December 2025, the judge imposed a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, plus an additional 20 years. Trinity Pogue was 18 years old when she committed the murder. She was 19 when she was sentenced. She will not be eligible for parole until she is nearly 50 years old. The courtroom was filled with people who had known Jackson and who had come to see justice delivered. The loss of an 18-month-old child is a tragedy that leaves a permanent mark on everyone connected to it. Julian Williams lost his son. Jackson's extended family lost a child who had barely begun his life. Trinity Pogue is 20 years old. She is incarcerated in Georgia, serving a sentence of life plus 20 years. She will not be eligible for parole for 3 decades. The title of Miss Donaldsonville 2023 will forever be associated with the murder of Jackson Drew Angelus, a child who died because the person entrusted with his care resented his existence. Case 7, Teresa Katomsky. In August 2009, a retired police officer in Pierpont, Ohio, fell gravely ill after ingesting what investigators later determined was ethylene glycol, the active ingredient in antifreeze. Raymond Katomsky, 65 years old, had been married to Teresa Katomsky for 5 years. She was a former beauty queen and pageant contestant who had also worked as a corrections officer. To those who knew them, they appeared to be a stable, devoted couple. Raymond's sudden illness and subsequent death did not immediately raise suspicions. Ethylene glycol poisoning can mimic natural medical conditions, and Raymond was elderly. But 5 years after his death, investigators reopened the case, and the evidence pointed to Teresa. She had poisoned her husband, likely by mixing the antifreeze into a sweet drink that would have disguised the bitter taste. The motive appeared to be financial gain and a desire to leave the marriage with Raymond's assets. Teresa Katomsky was 53 years old at the time of her arrest in March 2014. She is 65 years old as of 2026. She had competed in pageants, including the Mrs. Ohio contest, and had worked as a corrections officer before retiring. She was a former beauty queen and grandmother who appeared to be a devoted wife to Raymond, a retired police officer. The couple had been married for 5 years when Raymond died, and there were no obvious signs of marital discord. Teresa cultivated an image of stability and respectability. That image was a fiction. Raymond Katomsky was 65 years old when he died in August 2009. He had spent his career in law enforcement and had retired to enjoy his later years with Teresa. He was a man who had served his community and who had earned the right to a peaceful retirement. Instead, he was poisoned by the woman he had married. Ethylene glycol is a particularly cruel method of murder. It causes the victim to become gravely ill, suffering from symptoms that can include nausea, vomiting, confusion, and eventually organ failure. Raymond's death was slow and painful, and Teresa waited until he was unconscious before calling for help. When emergency responders arrived, she claimed that he had simply become ill on his own. The method Teresa used was calculated. Ethylene glycol is sweet-tasting, which makes it easy to disguise in beverages. The toxin attacks the kidneys and other organs, leading to a death that can appear to be from natural causes if the poisoning is not suspected. In Raymond's case, his death was initially attributed to natural illness. He was elderly, and the symptoms he exhibited were consistent with a number of medical conditions. No autopsy was performed that specifically tested for ethylene glycol. The case went cold. 5 years later, in 2014, investigators received new information that prompted them to reopen the case. The details of what triggered the renewed investigation are not fully documented, but by March 2014, Teresa Katomsky was under scrutiny. Investigators exhumed Raymond's body and conducted toxicology tests. The tests revealed the presence of ethylene glycol in his system. The poisoning had been deliberate. Teresa was arrested in March 2014 and charged with murder. The trial was held as a bench trial, meaning that a judge, rather than a jury, decided the verdict. Prosecutors presented the toxicology evidence, testimony about the timeline of Raymond's illness, and evidence that Teresa had access to antifreeze and the opportunity to administer it. The defense did not present a compelling alternative explanation for the presence of ethylene glycol in Raymond's body. The judge found Teresa Katomsky guilty of murder and sentenced her to 15 years to life in prison. Teresa Katomsky is 65 years old. She is incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, where she will remain for the foreseeable future. Her earliest possible release date would be after serving 15 years, but there is no guarantee that she will be granted parole. Raymond Katomsky was a retired police officer who had dedicated his life to public service. He married Teresa, believing that he had found a partner for his later years. Instead, He was poisoned by a woman who saw him as an obstacle to financial gain. The 5-year gap between Raymond's death and Teresa's arrest meant that she had 5 years of freedom, while the truth about what she had done remained hidden. The reopening of the case and the toxicology results brought that freedom to an end. Case 8. Karina Cooper. Forensic investigators examined the gun and found something unusual. Cooking grease from a London broil dinner was on the magazine and slide of the .22 caliber rifle. The grease proved that Karina Cooper had handled and loaded the weapon after preparing dinner, while an argument with her husband was underway. In July 2021, Ryan Cooper was found dead in his recliner in his home in Alona, Iowa. He had been shot twice in the head. His wife called 911 and reported that she had discovered his body. She told investigators that she had been in another part of the house when she heard the shots and that she had no idea who had killed him. The story was a lie. Backspatter from the gunfire was found on her clothing, placing her in a kneeling position directly over Ryan when she fired the shots. Investigators also discovered Snapchat messages between Karina and her lover, a man named Isaac Danker, in which Danker had sent her a signal to proceed with the murder. Karina Cooper had killed her husband for a $500,000 life insurance policy and the fantasy of starting a new life with Danker. Karina Cooper was 46 years old at the time of her trial. She had been a beauty queen contestant in Iowa and was well known in the small town of Alona. Where she and Ryan lived, she was involved in community events and appeared to be a typical member of the local social fabric. She had been married to Ryan Cooper, but by 2021, the marriage had deteriorated. Karina had begun a secret affair with Isaac Danker, and the relationship had progressed to the point where she was willing to kill her husband to be with him. Ryan Cooper was Karina's husband. He was a man who lived in Alona and who had built a life with Karina over the course of their marriage. On the day he died in July 2021, he was sitting in his recliner, likely unaware that his wife was about to execute him. He was vulnerable and unsuspecting. Karina took advantage of that vulnerability. She approached him while he was seated, knelt beside him, and fired 2 shots into his head with a .22 caliber rifle. The shots killed him instantly. The crime was discovered when Karina called 911 and reported finding Ryan's body. She told investigators that she had been in another part of the house when she heard gunshots and that she had rushed to the living room to find Ryan dead. The story unraveled quickly. Forensic investigators examined Karina's clothing and found backspatter from the gunfire. Backspatter occurs when blood and tissue are expelled backward toward the shooter during a gunshot. The presence of backspatter on Karina's clothing proved that she had been in close proximity to Ryan when the shots were fired. The pattern of the spatter indicated that she had been kneeling directly over him, which was inconsistent with her claim that she had been in another room. Investigators also obtained Snapchat messages between Karina and Isaac Danker. The messages showed that Danker had sent Karina a signal to proceed with the murder. The messages were explicit. This was not a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. It was premeditated murder carried out for financial gain. Karina Cooper was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial took place in July 2025. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, the Snapchat messages, and testimony from experts who explained the significance of the backspatter. The defense did not present a credible alternative explanation. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted Karina Cooper of first-degree murder and sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Karina Cooper is currently incarcerated in Iowa, serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole. She will remain in prison for the rest of her life. Ryan Cooper was killed by the woman he had married, shot twice in the head while he sat in his recliner. the $500,000 life insurance policy that Karina hoped to collect will never be hers. Isaac Danker, the man she killed for, has not been publicly charged in connection with the murder, though the Snapchat messages make clear that he was aware of the plan. Case 9. Titled Laura Hall. In August 2005, a 21-year-old University of Texas student named Jennifer Cave was shot and killed in an apartment in the Orange Tree condos in Austin. After her death, her body was dismembered. Her head and hands were found in a trash bag in the bathtub. The person who killed her was Colton Petoniak, a fellow student with whom she had spent the evening. The person who helped him attempt to cover up the crime was Laura Ashley Hall, Petoniak's girlfriend, a former pageant participant from a wealthy family who was described by those who knew her as a good girl. What Laura Hall did after Jennifer Cave was murdered revealed a capacity for loyalty that bordered on obsession. She helped Petoniak attempt to dispose of the body, fled with him to Mexico, and stood by him even as the evidence against him became overwhelming. Laura Ashley Hall was born in 1984. She was 21 years old in August 2005. She attended the University of Texas at Austin and came from a wealthy family. She had participated in beauty pageants and had a reputation as someone who had been raised with privilege and opportunity. She was dating Colton Petoniak, a troubled student with a history of drug use and erratic behavior. Laura's relationship with Petoniak was intense, and those who knew her described her as devoted to him to the point of losing her sense of judgment. Jennifer Cave was 21 years old when she was killed. She was a friend of Colton Petoniak and had spent time with him socially. On the night of her death in August 2005, she went to his apartment at the Orange Tree condos in Austin, Texas. What happened between them is not entirely clear, but at some point, Petoniak shot Jennifer Cave and killed her. After her death, he began the process of dismembering her body. It was at this point that Laura Hall became involved. Laura Hall did not kill Jennifer Cave. Colton Petoniak did. But what Laura did after the murder was assist in the attempted cover-up. She helped Petoniak with the dismemberment. Jennifer's head and hands were severed from her body and placed in a trash bag in the bathtub. The gruesome discovery was made when police, alerted by Jennifer's family, entered the apartment and found the remains. Laura and Colton had fled to Mexico before the body was discovered. They were apprehended by U.S. Marshals and brought back to Texas to face charges. Laura Hall was charged with tampering with evidence. The trial made clear that while she had not killed Jennifer Cave, she had actively participated in the effort to destroy evidence and cover up the crime. Prosecutors argued that Laura's actions were driven by blind loyalty to Petoniak, a man who had committed murder and who had involved her in the aftermath. The defense argued that Laura had been manipulated or coerced, but the evidence showed that she had made deliberate choices. She had helped with the dismemberment. She had fled to Mexico with Petoniak. She had stood by him even after it became clear what he had done. Laura Hall was originally sentenced to 5 years in prison for tampering with evidence. The sentence was later increased to 10 years after a resentencing. She served her time and was released in 2018. Colton Petoniak was convicted of murder and sentenced to 55 years in prison. He remains incarcerated. Laura Hall is 41 years old. She was released from prison in 2018 and is no longer incarcerated. The case became a subject of intense media coverage, in part because of the horrific nature of Jennifer Cave's murder and dismemberment. Jennifer Cave's family was left to mourn a daughter whose life was ended violently and whose body was desecrated after death. Laura Hall's participation in the cover-up extended the trauma inflicted on Jennifer's loved ones. The case stands as an example of how loyalty can become complicity and how a person's choices in the aftermath of a crime can define them as much as the crime itself. Case 10. Mary Catherine Higdon. In September 2018, a 24-year-old preschool teacher and former beauty queen contestant in Griffin, Georgia, shot and killed her live-in boyfriend, Stephen Freeman, during a domestic argument. The case appeared straightforward. Stephen Freeman, 23 years old, was found dead in the home he shared with Mary Catherine Higdon. Kate had called 911 and admitted to shooting him. But the physical evidence told a story that complicated the prosecution's case. Police found cooking grease from a London broil dinner on the magazine and slide of the gun Kate had used. The grease proved that she had handled and loaded the weapon after the argument had begun, while she was still in the kitchen preparing dinner. The details suggested premeditation, or, at the very least, a deliberate decision to arm herself during the confrontation. Despite this evidence and a contested confession, a jury acquitted Mary Catherine Higdon of murder in 2019. The verdict was controversial, and the case remains one of the most debated beauty queen criminal cases in recent Georgia history. Mary Catherine Higdon, known as Kate, was 24 years old when Stephen Freeman was killed. She worked as a preschool teacher in Griffin, Georgia, and had competed in beauty pageants. She and Stephen had been in a relationship and were living together. The relationship had been volatile, and there had been arguments in the past. On the night of September 2018, the couple had a domestic dispute that escalated to violence. Stephen Freeman was 23 years old when he died. He was Kate's live-in boyfriend, and the two had built a life together despite the tensions in their relationship. On the night he was killed, he and Kate had been arguing. The argument occurred while Kate was preparing a London broil for dinner. At some point during the confrontation, Kate retrieved a gun, loaded it, and shot Stephen. He died from the gunshot wound. The evidence that made the case unusual was the cooking grease. When police examined the firearm, they found grease from the London broil on the magazine and the slide of the gun. The grease proved that Kate had handled the weapon after she had been cooking, which meant she had loaded the gun during or after the argument. The presence of the grease suggested that the shooting was not a spontaneous act of self-defense in response to an immediate threat. It suggested that Kate had made a deliberate decision to arm herself. Prosecutors also pointed to a confession that Kate had made, though the defense contested the circumstances under which the confession was obtained. The trial took place in 2019. Prosecutors argued that Kate had murdered Stephen during the argument, and that the grease evidence proved she had loaded the weapon with the intent to use it. The defense argued that Kate had acted in self-defense, that the relationship had been abusive, and that she had feared for her life. The jury heard the evidence, deliberated, and returned a verdict of not guilty. The acquittal was shocking to many observers, given the physical evidence and the confession. But the jury was not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Kate had committed murder. Mary Catherine Higdon was acquitted in 2019 and is not incarcerated. The case remains controversial. Prosecutors and some members of the public believe that the evidence supported a murder conviction and that the jury's decision to acquit was a miscarriage of justice. Others believe that the jury made the correct decision based on the evidence presented and that Kate acted in self-defense. Stephen Freeman's family was left without the closure that a conviction might have provided. The cooking grease on the gun remains one of the most unusual pieces of evidence in a domestic violence case, and the acquittal ensures that the case will be remembered as one of the most controversial involving a beauty queen defendant.